My sister-in-law hit me at my own anniversary dinner, right in front of my children, because I fixed myself a plate before she did. "Don't forget where you stand in this family," she said, her hand still lifted like she was pleased with herself. My husband looked down. He didn't get up. He didn't say one word for me. So I laid down my fork, wiped my fingers on the linen napkin I had ironed that morning, and slapped her back harder without pausing to think twice. Then I turned to the man I had loved since I was 22 and said, "Any man who can watch his wife be humiliated in a room full of people and do nothing is not worthy of being her husband." I took my daughter's hand in one of mine and my son's in the other, and I walked out of the house I had paid for, still wearing the dress I'd bought for the evening. 2 years later, the same people who told me to remember my place would learn, in the most painful way possible, exactly what theirs was. My name is Joselyn Callaway, and I was raised in a home with a circular driveway and more square footage than any child needs to understand privilege. My father built half the office parks in our county from a construction loan and sheer will. I never lacked for comfort growing up. But the one thing I wanted most was the one thing money could never hand me. A love that felt chosen for me, not arranged around appearances or accounts. I didn't want something negotiated between two families with matching fortunes. I wanted something real. I found that in Grantham Thorne when I was 22, in a coffee shop 3 blocks from my college apartment on an ordinary rainy Tuesday that somehow turned into the beginning of my life. He was nothing like the polished men my mother liked to place in front of me at country club luncheons. Grantham drove a car with 200,000 miles on it and worked long, unremarkable hours at a mid-sized architecture firm, sketching buildings he wasn't senior enough to design on his own. That first afternoon, he made me laugh so hard I spilled my drink across the table and all over both of us. Neither of us cared. We talked for 4 hours. I missed a study group I had promised to attend and didn't think about it again until the next morning. My father was wary of him in that quiet way. Fathers are wary of men who arrive without a polished resume attached to their name. My mother worried more than once that a man marrying into money might eventually decide he could tolerate the woman if it meant gaining everything around her. I told her she was wrong. I was so sure of myself then, standing in my parents' kitchen defending a man I had known for 8 months, convinced she simply couldn't see what I had found. We married in a small ceremony my parents paid for in the garden behind my grandmother's old church. Grantham's family came with a strange, watchful stiffness that I mistook for shyness. It wasn't shyness. It was calculation, quiet, patient, and beyond my understanding at the time. Grantham's mother, Finanella, ruled her home like a tiny kingdom. His older sister, Wilhelmina, was the undisputed princess of it, unmarried, financially dependent on the struggling catering business her late husband had left behind, and quietly bitter toward anyone who threatened to shift the family's balance by even an inch. I was that threat, whether I meant to be or not. I had my own money, my own mind, and a husband who, in those early years, at least seemed to look at me as though I mattered more than his sister's approval. That did not last long. I remember the first real fracture because I have replayed it in my mind more times than I can count. It was our second Thanksgiving as a married couple. I had spent the entire day cooking from recipe cards written in my late grandmother's hand. Wilhelmina took a bite of the stuffing, placed her fork down with a soft, deliberate click against the china, and said to the table, "It's always charming when someone works this hard to prove she belongs somewhere she clearly wasn't born into." Everyone gave that small, uneasy laugh people use when they understand the insult perfectly, but prefer not to name it. Grantham reached for the gravy and changed the subject to football. I sat there gripping my water glass so tightly my fingers hurt and said nothing. The next year, at my son Callahan's christening, Finanella cornered me near the coat closet while I was still holding my newborn. In the gentlest voice imaginable, she told me, "Money can buy a lovely nursery, dear, but it can't buy grace." I do wonder sometimes what our grandchildren absorb from being surrounded by too much of it. I stood there rocking my son and said nothing, By then, I had already learned that answering back only made the air in the room colder for days, and Grantham never once stepped in unless he was forced to. 2 years later, at Finanella's birthday dinner, I quietly paid the entire catering bill after Wilhelmina's thriving business came up short at the last minute. No one thanked me. Wilhelmina simply said, loud enough for the caterers to hear, how nice that Joselyn has finally found a purpose for all that family money besides decorating. That night, I laughed along. By then, laughing had become its own kind of armor. There were dozens of moments like that over the years. Small, exact cruelties wrapped in smiles, always delivered in front of enough people to make any objection sound dramatic. And always followed by my husband's brand of silence, not open agreement, just a steady unwillingness to sacrifice even a trace of his own comfort for mine. Year after year, I told myself it was worth enduring. Love meant absorbing a few sharp comments for the sake of harmony, for the sake of my children having grandparents, for the sake of the man I had chosen over every safer option my parents had once quietly laid before me. I told myself many things over 11 years of marriage. Every one of them was a lie I needed in order to keep loving him without choking on the resentment. By then, we had 2 children, my daughter Beatrix, 7, bright and sharp as glass, and my son Callahan, 5, who adored his father with the pure devotion only little boys seem capable of. I had also built a career of my own, running a boutique interior design firm that had, over time, quietly begun to out-earn Grantham's salary at the architecture firm. I never used that to diminish him. I never tried to make him feel lesser for it, not even during the months when I was covering the entire mortgage myself. Because my work required frequent travel, site visits, installations, sourcing trips out of state, Grantham had gradually taken over most of our daily banking. At the time, it seemed like a practical division of labor, a partnership, so I kept smoothing over every silence his family created because I still believed marriage was something you protected, even when it had clearly stopped protecting you back. The house we lived in, a colonial with a wraparound porch that Wilhelmina loved to comment on, as if she owned some invisible part of it, had been purchased with help from my family. My father covered the down payment as a wedding gift, and every renovation since had been paid for by me, room by room, with money I earned myself. On paper, the house belonged equally to Grantham and me. In practice, Finanella and Wilhelmina treated it like a Thorne family property I was merely being allowed to occupy, so long as I behaved correctly and remembered whose name, in their minds, carried more weight at the table. I did not yet understand how literal that belief really was. Our 11th wedding anniversary fell on a Saturday in early autumn. For once, I wanted to celebrate the way I remembered our first years, warm, simple, and entirely ours. The week before, Grantham asked whether his mother and sister could join us, just this once, because it would mean so much to Finanella to be included. Because I was still trying, even after everything, I said yes. I spent 3 days preparing that dinner, roast chicken with rosemary and lemon, a wild rice dish my mother taught me when I was a girl, a chocolate torte I practiced twice before getting it right. I set the table myself, pressed the linens myself, picked flowers from my mother's garden that morning, and arranged them in a low bowl. Finanella arrived first, trailing her fingers over the tablecloth the way a woman inspects a business she doesn't believe will survive. Wilhelmina came 20 minutes late, exactly as she always did, and took the seat at the head of the table, a seat Grantham silently let her have in our house, on our anniversary, without so much as glancing at me. I let it go. I always let it go. When dinner was ready, I served the children first so their food wouldn't cool. Then I fixed my own plate and sat down. I had barely lifted my fork when Wilhelmina reached across the table and slapped me across the face. My ears rang. My vision flashed white at the edges. "You forget your place in this family," she said. Her voice was loud enough that Beatrix dropped her fork against her plate. Callahan froze with food halfway to his mouth. The room went silent except for the pounding of my own pulse. I looked at Grantham. I looked at the man I had married for love. The man whose family I had fed, supported, and forgiven for 11 straight years. He lowered his eyes to his plate, as if the pattern in the tablecloth required more attention than the red mark spreading across his wife's face. Something inside me, something that had been splintering for more than a decade, finally broke all the way through. I laid down my fork. I wiped my hands slowly on my napkin, the way you do when your body is trying to catch up to a decision your soul has already made. Then I reached across the table and slapped Wilhelmina back with the full force of 11 years of silence behind it. The gasp that moved around the table almost made me laugh, as though I were the one violating some sacred rule. I stood. I looked at Grantham, not at Wilhelmina, not at Finanella, at him, and said the words that had been living in my chest for years. A husband who cannot defend his wife in front of a room full of people does not deserve to remain her husband. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just sat there, stunned, like a man who had never considered that his silence might one day come with a price. I took Beatrix's hand in mine and Callahan's in the other, and I walked my children out of that dining room, out of that house, and into my car, still wearing the dress I had bought for the two of us. I drove straight to my parents' home, 40 minutes away. My mother opened the door before I could knock, took one look at my face, and said, "Come inside, baby. You're safe now." My parents' house had always felt like a fortress, but not the kind built to keep me in line. The kind built to keep me safe. My mother had the guest wing ready for me and the children within a day, and never once asked how long we intended to stay. My father held me tightly enough that, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, I felt completely unafraid. Grantham called that night, and the next morning, and then every few hours after that, until my phone seemed to vibrate constantly in my pocket. I let most of it go to voicemail. When I finally answered 3 days later, sitting alone on my parents' back porch, he was full of the kind of apology that dresses itself up as love when it is really just fear. "I should have said something. I know that now. I'm sorry. We can fix this. My family will apologize. Please come home. The kids need their father." I asked him one question. "How many times, Grantham? How many times in 11 years have you watched your mother or sister humiliate me at my own table and said nothing?" He had no answer, because we both already knew it. Too many. I had stopped counting around year 4 because keeping count made staying unbearable. In those first strange, quiet weeks, I leaned more heavily than I expected on my business partner, Hyen, a steady woman who had built my design firm beside me from a 2-desk office into a company that now employed 11 people. She showed up at my parents' porch the Sunday after the dinner with takeout and no pressure, sat with me while the children napped, and said, "I've watched you carry that family for 10 years. Whatever you decide next, let the firm carry you." It was such a small sentence, but it shattered me because it was the first time in years anyone had reminded me that I was allowed to be supported instead of being the one doing all the supporting. I filed for divorce 11 days after the anniversary dinner. I hired an attorney named Barnaby Coyle, a calm, razor-sharp man my father had trusted for years in business matters. I told him plainly what I wanted, my children, my house, and the truth about what that family had really been doing to us for more than a decade. By then, a quiet suspicion had taken root in me. Beneath Finanella and Wilhelmina's cruelty, I suspected there had been money involved all along. I was right. I just didn't know how deep it went. Barnaby found the first piece buried in the financial disclosures required for the divorce. Over 4 years, more than $60,000 had been moved out of our joint household account in small, irregular transfers, never large enough on their own to trigger alarm, easy to miss because Grantham had handled most of our monthly banking for years while I was often traveling for work. The money had gone to Wilhelmina, not as gifts, as loans that were never repaid, quietly passed through Grantham to keep his sister's catering business afloat, a business Finanella had been propping up for years and refusing to let die, no matter how much money it bled behind a polished storefront. Grantham had approved those transfers using an account funded almost entirely by my earnings, and he had never once told me where the money was actually going. As painful as that was, it wasn't the worst discovery. Deeper in the paperwork was a notarized quitclaim form dated 18 months earlier. It attempted to transfer a 10% ownership stake in our house, the same house my father had helped me buy, into Finanella's name. My signature was at the bottom, a signature I had never written. Barnaby brought in a forensic document examiner who immediately flagged inconsistencies in pen pressure and lift patterns that didn't match the real signatures on file with our mortgage lender. It was a believable forgery, but not a flawless one. Even then, Barnaby warned me not to expect anything quick. A case involving forged property documents, he said, would have to work its way through the recorder's office and possibly into a criminal referral, and processes like that moved slowly, even when the evidence looked strong from the start. The county recorder's office confirmed something that made me go cold. Their own verification process had flagged the transfer months earlier and quietly suspended it pending documentation that never arrived. The transfer had never been completed, but the attempt had been real. It had been deliberate, and according to Barnaby, it was very likely criminal. He sat across from me in his office, legal pad covered in neat handwriting, and walked me through what that kind of timeline actually meant. The recorder's office would need to formally document the flagged filing and turn over its internal records. A detective from Financial Crimes would need to interview the notary who processed the document to determine whether she had been duped or was involved. Bank records linked to the notarization fee might need to be subpoenaed. None of it, he said plainly, would move as quickly as the divorce itself. I remember sitting there, realizing I might still be hearing updates about this case years later, long after the custody papers were signed and the moving boxes unpacked. I called my father that evening from the parking garage outside Barnaby's office because I could not make myself say those words inside my parents' house where the children might hear. He listened without interrupting, the same way he had listened when I was little. When I finished, he said only, "You built that house with your own 2 hands as much as any contractor ever did. No one takes that from you while I'm still alive." It wasn't legal advice. It was simply what I needed. Then Barnaby uncovered something none of us expected. Cross-checking county records out of habit, he found that Finanella had tried nearly the same quitclaim maneuver once before, decades earlier, in a property dispute involving her late husband's sister. That matter had been quietly settled out of public view. This was not a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, and she had simply been waiting for another unguarded moment to try it again. The final piece came from somewhere I never would have anticipated. A former employee of Wilhelmina's catering company, a young woman named Odessa, who had quit 2 years earlier after going unpaid for a month, contacted Barnaby after hearing quietly that there was an investigation. She had kept copies of invoices she had once been told to inflate for family events, including my own anniversary dinner, so that part of what I paid could be quietly redirected elsewhere. It was a small amount compared to everything else, but it confirmed what I had already started to suspect. Nothing about that family's warmth toward me had ever been entirely genuine. During a second conversation with Barnaby, Odessa mentioned almost casually that she had seen Wilhelmina do the same thing to at least one other client. A bride who had never realized the final invoice didn't match what had actually been delivered. Barnaby noted it. It never became part of our case directly. But it was one more confirmation that this wasn't some isolated act of desperation. It was simply how they operated when they thought no one outside the family was paying close enough attention. The next 2 years unfolded more slowly than I wanted, and, in some ways, faster than I feared. Barnaby referred the forged quitclaim attempt to the district attorney's financial crimes unit, and the recorder's office fully cooperated, turning over the internal records showing the filing had been flagged before completion. When confronted with the transfer history, Grantham insisted he knew nothing about the forgery itself, only about the money being given to his sister, which he still described as helping family. As if that wasn't exactly what I had been doing for 11 years. Helping family, generously, without ever demanding anything in return. I didn't entirely believe him. By then, it didn't matter whether I did. The custody case moved forward based on a pattern I hadn't even realized I had been documenting for years. Photographs, calendar entries, messages, proof that I had managed every school function, every doctor's appointment, every midnight fever, while Grantham repeatedly deferred to his mother's opinions about how our children should be raised. The court awarded me primary custody. Grantham received a structured parenting schedule, and the court required a full accounting of where the missing $60,000 had gone before certain visitation terms would be finalized. Beatrix struggled more than Callahan in those early months. She was old enough to know something had shifted permanently, but still too young to name it. One night, curled against my side on the sofa, she asked me if it had somehow been her fault. If serving her own plate that night had made things worse. I took her face in both my hands and told her the truth. Nothing about that dinner had ever been about a plate. It had been about a woman who needed someone smaller than herself to dominate in order to feel powerful, and that was never, not for 1 second, Beatrix's fault. Callahan, in his own 5-year-old way, simply wanted to know when he would get his own room back. I promised him a version of home that did not exist yet, but that I intended to build anyway. By the second year, both children had settled into a rhythm that felt, to my enormous relief, almost ordinary. Beatrix joined a soccer team at her new school and came home talking more about a girl named Priscilla on the team than anything that had happened at that dinner table. Callahan stopped asking about his old room, once the new one filled with the same dinosaur posters and half-broken toy trucks he had always loved. One Saturday afternoon, I watched him build an entire city out of couch cushions and realized that children draw far more resilience from a peaceful home than they ever do from a complicated one, held together by silence. The house, my house, was restored fully to my name after the forensic examiner's report was accepted by family court and Finanella's ownership claim was formally voided by the county. The criminal referral against her moved slowly, exactly as Barnaby had warned it would. At the time I tell this story, the district attorney's office is still building the case, and Barnaby says matters like this can take years before anyone ever steps into a courtroom, but the civil side was already resolved. Grantham, rather than fight a fraud investigation that would have dragged his mother and sister further into the light, agreed to a settlement that included full repayment of the diverted funds through structured installments. Wilhelmina's catering company collapsed within the first year after the family could no longer keep funneling money into it that had never truly belonged to them. Later, a handful of her longtime clients told mutual acquaintances they had suspected for years that something about her billing was off, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. Finanella, faced with the very real possibility of scrutiny over both the recent quitclaim attempt and the older pattern Barnaby had uncovered, withdrew entirely from any further contact with me. Not, I suspect, from remorse, but from fear. News spread through the extended family the way it always does. Quietly, sideways, and all at once. My father's older brother, a retired judge who had always kept a courteous distance from Grantham's side of the family, called me directly after hearing about the forged filing and told me he had never trusted Finanella's warmth. Not once in all the years he had watched her at family gatherings. Grantham's younger cousin, Desmond, a soft-spoken man who had always kind to me in the background, sent me a brief private message once the story became too large for the family to keep contained. He said he was sorry, that he had seen things over the years and never said anything. I appreciated it. And I also understood exactly what it was. Another version of the same silence I had lived inside for 11 years, only gentler and far too late to alter anything. Somewhere in the middle of that second year, while the criminal referral sat in a long line at the district attorney's office, and the custody schedule finally settled into something the children could rely on, I noticed a change in myself I had not expected. My design firm grew faster in those 2 years than it had in the previous 5 combined. Clients began asking why my work suddenly felt bolder, less cautious, less eager to please every possible taste in a room. I never had a polished answer for them. I only knew that a version of me no longer wasting half her life managing someone else's family had far more energy left for everything else. Grantham asked to see me one last time before the divorce was finalized. He sat across from me in Barnaby's conference room, looking somehow older than he had 2 years earlier, and said the words I once would have given almost anything to hear. "I'm sorry for all of it. I should have chosen you every time, and I didn't." I believe he meant it, but an apology that arrives only after the money is uncovered, and the papers are already being signed, is not repentance. It is damage control. And it comes far too late to mean what it once could have. I had spent 11 years forgiving smaller versions of that same failure, hoping each time the next humiliation would be the one that finally changed him. The anniversary dinner had only been the last straw atop a decade-long pile, and I was finished handing out forgiveness to a man who treated it like an endless resource. "I know," I told him, "but I'm not the woman who kept forgiving you anymore, and I have no desire to become her again." The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday. I walked out of the courthouse holding both of my children's hands, the same way I had led them out of that dining room 2 years earlier. But this time, I wasn't fleeing. This time, I was walking toward the rest of our lives, toward a house that belonged fully and only to us. The week the divorce was finalized, Hyun hosted a small dinner for me and the children. Nothing fancy. Just her kitchen table crowded with mismatched chairs and more food than any of us could finish. But it was the first celebration of any kind I had had in years, where every single person at the table genuinely wanted me there. That night, I served myself first without thinking about it. No one blinked. My mother sat across from me, watching my children argue cheerfully over the last dinner roll, and said softly that she had not seen me laugh that easily in more than a decade. She was right. I hadn't even realized how much of myself I had lost until I heard it spoken aloud. Not long ago, Beatrix asked me why Aunt Wilhelmina doesn't come to her birthday parties anymore. I told her the truth in words a child could carry. Some people forget that love is not something they're entitled to just because someone keeps giving it freely. Sometimes the people who love them most are the ones who finally have to show them where that giving ends. I think about that dinner often. Not the slap. I have never regretted returning it. What I think about is the silence that came before it. 11 years of signs of silence from the one person who was supposed to stand between me and a room full of people determined to reduce me. In the end, I learned that the place I belonged was never at the edge of someone else's table, waiting patiently for scraps of respect. It was at the head of my own. And if someone in your own family has ever made you feel like you had to earn a seat at a table where you were already entitled to sit, then maybe the real question is this: how much longer would it take before you finally stood up and left for good?